The sensor console on the bridge of the ISV Keth Ascendant beeped. Then it beeped again. Then, as if personally offended by its own readings, it beeped a third time, louder than the first two combined. Commander Vorruk, Supreme Battle Chief of II. The Keth Dominion's 7th Enforcement Fleet turned slowly from the viewport. He was a being of great patience. He had conquered 14 star systems. He had watched entire armadas dissolve into debris fields. He was not someone who startled easily. "Theiss," he said very calmly. "Why is my sensor console having a breakdown?" "Lieutenant." Theiss, a slender, four-armed navigator with nervous eyes and an even more nervous set of antennae, tapped the console twice. She stared at it. She tapped it again. Then she did something Vorruk had never seen her do in 11 cycles of service. She laughed, not a joyful laugh. The kind of laugh you produce when the universe has just told you something impossible and your brain refuses to process it any other way. "Sir," she said, "it is reading that vessel out there as a human warship." A silence dropped over the bridge like a lead curtain. Pelan, the weapons officer, actually turned around in his seat. "A what?" "A human warship," Theiss repeated. "Configuration unknown. Mass readings are—" "Sir, the mass readings are not reasonable." Vorruk walked to the console. He looked at the screen. He looked at Theiss. He looked at the screen again. "Run diagnostics," he said. "Already running, sir." "Run them again." She ran them again. The screen said the same thing it had said before. Vorruk stared through the viewport at the object hanging in space, approximately 40,000 kilometers ahead of them. From this distance it looked like a long, dark shape. Something thick and angular with no lights running along its hull. No transponder signal, no diplomatic identification code. Nothing. Just mass. A frankly alarming amount of mass. "They have no transponder active," Pelan said, squinting at his own display. "No hailing frequency, no communication signal at all." "Yes," Vorruk agreed slowly, "because when a predator is hunting, it does not announce itself." Nobody laughed at that. The Keth Dominion had, at various points in its long and distinguished history of aggressive expansion, encountered the humans. Not in full-scale war. Never that. Nobody in the known galaxy had been foolish enough to push things that far, and there was a very specific reason for that. A reason that was currently sitting 40,000 kilometers away, being absolutely infuriatingly quiet. The humans were not the largest species in the galaxy. They were not the oldest. They did not have the most refined biology or the most extensive territory. What they had as a collective race was something that no sensor array could quantify and no diplomatic summit had ever successfully explained. They called it, in their own blunt, graceless language, a mean streak. Vorruk had read the reports. He had studied the battles that other empires had picked with humans. He had reviewed the wreckage, the aftermath, the emergency transmissions that came through with phrases like, "We did not anticipate," and "the engagement went poorly." He had done all of this research for exactly the reason he was now staring at this ship, because his fleet had just intercepted what the Dominion High Command had described as an unregistered civilian transport, wandering into Keth territorial space without clearance, and now his sensors were telling him it was not a civilian transport. "Grox," Vorruk said, addressing his communications officer without turning away from the viewport. "Hail them." Grox, a compact and deeply unhappy-looking officer who had been on this bridge for 20 years and had developed a survival instinct that bordered on supernatural, did not move immediately. "Sir," he said carefully, "are you certain you want to be the first one to speak?" "Hail them." Grox hailed them. For 11 seconds there was nothing, just static, and the deep hum of the Keth Ascendant's drives, and the very quiet sound of Lieutenant Theiss's antennae trembling. Then the channel opened. A human voice came through. Relaxed, almost bored. The voice of someone who had been napping, and was mildly annoyed at being woken up. "Keth vessel," the voice said. "This is Captain Taren Voss of the USEF Relentless Promise. You have got your guns pointed at my ship. I would like to know if that was an accident or if you would like to have a very short conversation about consequences." Vorruk stared at the open channel. Grox stared at Vorruk. This's antennae had stopped trembling. They had simply gone flat. "Sir," Pelan whispered from the weapons console, "I am reading 17 active targeting locks on our hull." 17. Vorruk closed his eyes. Just briefly, just for one moment. He took a long breath, the way a being takes a breath when they realize they have made a terrible, terrible miscalculation. "Do not," he said very quietly, "touch anything." The bridge of the ISV Keth Ascendant had never been so quiet in its entire operational history. Vorruk stood at the center of it, a being who had faced down rebellions, handled assassination attempts with calm professionalism, and once negotiated a ceasefire while actively bleeding from 2 wounds. None of that had prepared him for this specific feeling. The feeling of 17 targeting locks sitting on his hull like uninvited house guests who had brought very large weapons to the dinner table. "Captain Voss," Vorruk said at last, keeping his voice at a register he hoped projected authority rather than the thing he was actually feeling, which was a sharp and thorough sense of regret. "This is Commander Vorruk of the Keth Dominion. We were conducting a routine intercept of what our intelligence identified as an unregistered transport vessel." A pause. Then the human voice came back, still carrying that same casual, almost pleasant tone that somehow made it worse. "Routine intercept," Taren Voss repeated. That is an interesting way to describe pointing 14 gun batteries at something. Very routine, very standard, very much the kind of thing that happens to me on a Tuesday." Vorruk heard Grox exhale behind him. It was the exhale of a being who was mentally reviewing his retirement options. "We did not," Vorruk said, choosing each word the way you choose your footing on unstable ground, "intend for this to escalate." "Oh, I know," Voss said cheerfully. "Nobody ever does. That is the funny thing about escalation. It is always a surprise to the people who started it." Pelan turned slowly from his weapons console and looked at Vorruk with an expression that said everything words could not. It said, "Sir, I have been a loyal officer, and if this goes badly, I want you to know that I would like my remains sent home to my family on the 4th moon of Geth Primus." Vorruk ignored the look. "We are prepared to stand down our targeting systems," Vorruk said, "as a gesture of good faith." "Wonderful," Voss said. "You do that, I will wait." There was something deeply unsettling about how patient the human sounded. Vorruk had dealt with aggressive species before. Aggressive species shouted, they postured, they made dramatic speeches about honor and retribution. Taren Voss sounded like a man who had already decided how this ended, and was simply giving Vorruk the time to arrive at the same conclusion on his own. "Pelan," Vorruk said, "stand down targeting." Pelan stood down targeting so fast his hands practically left friction burns on the console. "Targeting systems offline, sir," Pelan confirmed, and then added very quietly under his breath, "Please." The channel crackled again. "Good call, Commander," Voss said. "Now, here is what is going to happen. You are going to file a formal incident report with your high command. That report is going to note that the USEF Relentless Promise was operating in this sector under a joint survey agreement, reference number VX9 through 14, signed by your Dominion ambassador 14 months ago. You did not check. That happens. No permanent damage done." Vorruk turned to Thys. Thys was already pulling up the diplomatic registry. Her 4 hands moved across the console. She pulled the record. She read it. Her antennae rose slowly, all the way up, in the particular posture that meant profound personal embarrassment. "Sir," she said, "the agreement is real. We have a joint survey clearance on file for this exact sector." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from before. Before, it had been the silence of fear. This was the silence of A crew collectively processing the fact that their commander had aimed 14 gun batteries at a ship he was technically obligated to let pass freely, and the human on the other end had known that the entire time. He knew, Grox said softly, mostly to himself. He knew we made a mistake before he even opened the channel. Yes, Vorruk said, and he still locked 17 targeting solutions onto our hull. Yes, just to make sure we knew that he knew. Grox, Vorruk said, please stop talking. Grox, stop talking. Vorruk straightened his uniform. He pressed the channel open one final time. Captain Voss, he said, we will file the report. Safe travels. Always are, Voss replied, warm as a man who had just won a card game without ever showing his hand. You have a good one, Commander. The channel closed. On the sensor display, the USEF Relentless promise turned smoothly and moved away through the dark, its hull still showing no running lights, no transponder signal, nothing. Just mass. Just that quiet, patient, frankly unreasonable amount of mass disappearing into the stars the same way it had arrived, like it had never needed to be afraid, not even for a second. Vorruk looked at his crew. His crew looked at Vorruk. Nobody, he said firmly, mentions this at the debrief.